back to World Crisis Radio. One more reminder, my lecture on the Russian fleets of 1863 will be on C-SPAN, Saturday 6 p.m., Saturday 10 p.m., Sunday 11 a.m., all times are Eastern, and that's going to be this coming Saturday, Sunday on C-SPAN 3 American History television. Now, changing gears, we've entered into this geometry of ineffable sadness, but also of tremendous political insight, which is still there to be had. The Kennedy assassination, the 50th anniversary now approaching in less than a month. And I couldn't think of a better way to begin our examination of these questions than to invite Professor Joan Mellon, who teaches English at Temple University in Philadelphia. She is the author of what I consider to be the best single book on the subject, which is called A Farewell to Justice, Jim Garrison, JFK's Assassination, and the Case That Should Have Changed History. And I believe there's a recent second edition. The benefit of Joan Mellon's work is that she was actually a volunteer for the Jim Garrison prosecution of Clay Shaw in New Orleans back in the 1960s. So she has been a part of the investigation of the Kennedy assassination for all of these 5 decades, and therefore she brings an unparalleled historical overview. You cannot understand the state of the Kennedy assassination research and public understanding without this kind of a historical overview, which she provides. Now, there may be other studies that have some merit, and I'm going to ask her to bring us up to date on those. But if you're going to read one thing, make it A Farewell to Justice by Joan Mellon. Now, we got 4 segments today. We might be able to get Joan to come back at the end of the anniversary, maybe in December or January, and give us an update. But without further ado, let me welcome Joan Mellon.
Thank you, Webster. That was very kind introduction indeed.
No, every word deserved. Now, where would you like to start? Tell us.
Well, I'd like to start with Jim Garrison, and I'd like to mention, regarding all of the books that have been written in the last 20 years, that no single one of these books could have been written without Jim Garrison, because it was Jim Garrison who was the inspiration for Oliver Stone in his film JFK, and it was as a result of the film JFK and audiences wanting to know exactly what happened to President Kennedy, and that were not satisfied by the Warren Report, that led to Congress passing the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. And what this did was to have CIA, FBI, Office of Naval Intelligence, any number of intelligence services release what has come to be more than 5 million documents to the National Archives. And many of the authors who have written books in this period using these documents never bothered to tip their hats, at least, to Jim Garrison. So that's the first thing I want to say, that really he was the start. And not only that, but he was the first public official and the person to show the Zapruder film, which was the dress manufacturer Abraham Zapruder's home movie of the assassination, in court. And that was at the trial of a person from New Orleans named Clay Shaw. Clay Shaw was the director of the International Trade Mart and a CIA asset. And so the next thing I'd like to say is my book came out again this September. It's A Farewell to Justice, updated with a new 90-page edition. And the best document that I found that after the original edition of A Farewell to Justice was published, was a document issuing from the CIA's History Review Group. And this had to do with Clay Shaw, Garrison's suspect. And what it said was, in no uncertain terms, that Shaw was a highly paid CIA contract source. So all the people that have denied all these years that Shaw worked for CIA have been proven wrong. And I think one of the things we need to know is that the CIA's History Review Group did internal histories of CIA, not for the benefit of the public, not to be shown, but for internal use. So there was absolutely no reason for them to lie in this report. So I start the discussion and the update with this document.
Now, just in passing, though, Oliver Stone, I found, has somewhat retreated from what he did in the JFK film. The JFK film, I think, has won him eternal fame and gratitude. But when we go to that more recent book, The Untold History of the United States with Kuznick, it's the entire conspiracy simply disappeared. All we know about Kennedy is that he had powerful enemies, and that's it. So a step backwards, I'm afraid, by him.
But I have to say, in defense of Oliver Stone, that at the WEC conference last week in Pittsburgh, Cyril Wecht, who runs a forensic science institute at Duquesne University, held a huge conference, 3 days, all sorts of people, including Mark Lane, who first began the challenge to the Warren Commission. And Oliver Stone was there. And I was very pleased. I was there and I spoke, but I was very pleased that Oliver Stone reiterated his support of Jim Garrison. And that was so important because all those people, one after another, even Mark Lane, I have to say, who had gone to New Orleans and helped Jim Garrison, and nobody said the name Jim Garrison in the whole 3 days. And they had all sorts of people that were speaking, some kooks, some good, some respectable with scholarly credentials, others, I think, somewhat off the rails and with outlandish claims. Nobody said the word Jim Garrison. So I have to say that Oliver Stone stood by his subject, and again, I think there was just as much hostility toward the Jim Garrison as there had been 25 years ago. And
okay, now you mentioned this Cyril Wecht conference. Could you give us a kind of a summary of what came out of that, the general state of research and...
Well, what came out of it? Well, first of all, there was some very good talk, such as by Josiah Thompson, who wrote a book called 6 Seconds in Dallas, discussing the relationship between the acoustic evidence that has been found and the Zapruder film, and matching those, and really looking back over that evidence. There was also an interview with one of the doctors that I interviewed for A Farewell to Justice, named Robert McClelland, who had been at Parkland Hospital tending to President Kennedy, standing behind his head. And Dr. McClelland, both to me in 2005 and now, absolutely stands by that the back of President Kennedy's head was completely blown out, which indicates, of course, that he was shot from the front, and therefore not by Oswald and not from the Texas School Book Depository. So that, even though I knew it and all, it was good to hear Dr. McClelland saying those things again. And when Dr. McClelland went to the National Archives and looked at the x-rays and the autopsy photographs that are stored there, he found that the body had been altered, the head had been fixed up, the scalp, a piece of scalp had been pushed over the wound so that you couldn't see exactly what happened. You see definite government interference with covering up what happened to President Kennedy. So that was good. Mark Lane spoke, and that was always good because he's a historical figure in this story. And then there were people that I thought less of, let's put it that way. Webster, I have to say that my political understanding is that I am not a person who sees the Kennedys as saints. I'm saying that at the risk of the wrath of this group of people. But I see the evidence to me. I didn't say this at the conference. It wasn't my subject. But I couldn't help but note the insistence that Robert Kennedy did not have anything to do with plots to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Hang on one second, John. We've got a hard break. We'll be right back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Griffin here in Washington, D.C. We're talking with Joan Mellon, the author of what I regard as the premier study of the Kennedy assassination. Comes in the form of a biography of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, the only person to bring criminal charges and a trial against anybody in the Kennedy assassination, and, of course, a victim of the CIA discrediting committee or character assassination committee or whatever it is. Joan, just in terms of our listeners who may be fascinated by the Cyril Wecht conference, if they want to find that on the Internet, what you remember the title of this conference or some other way to track it?
The title of the conference was Passing the Torch. Passing the torch. And I don't think the transcript of the conference is on the internet, but the Wecht Institute at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh will be selling for a relatively inexpensive price, I'm not sure what, DVDs of the conference. So anyone who wants to see the conference, you can see it on in a few weeks, I guess, on DVD.
Now, you were talking about Robert Kennedy. Do you want to just finish that thought?
I'll just finish that thought now, and I in a way, it's sort of peripheral to what we're doing because it doesn't in any. After all, what we have to look at what President Kennedy did that made him so angry to CIA, and what CIA became so angry about, it seems to me, was that President Kennedy refused to send ground forces to Vietnam. And I think there's not much doubt about that. If we read the other side's story, which is McGeorge Bundy's autobiography, completed by his assistant, I think it's called Lessons in Disaster, what we see is every single day at Kennedy's cabinet meetings, we find McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, begging him to send troops to Vietnam, send 200, send this many, that many. And President Kennedy, without any support from anybody, except his own brother, resisted and didn't do it. And I think he started, there's no question, that he started to decrease the powers of CIA. We have a very different situation with Obama today. He's just doing what they want. But in the days of President Kennedy, he started to decrease the powers of the Director of Central Intelligence, as it was then called, and President Kennedy wanted to create a Director of National Intelligence over CIA. That was another of his ideas. Ironically, the person who appointed a Director of National Intelligence was George W. Bush, and by then it was too late. The Director of National Intelligence, his name is James Clapper today, has no power whatsoever. CIA is running the show of all the intelligence services, and there are quite a few. So
if I'm not mistaken, we do have General Douglas MacArthur coming in and telling Kennedy, don't send ground forces.
That's right, exactly, Webster, because General MacArthur went there and he said, you can't win a ground war in Asia. It's not a question of somebody being a saint, the Prince of Peace. President Kennedy did not want to lose. And MacArthur, of course, had learned the hard way himself, and he told the truth. And, of course, what the CIA wanted to do was to have the ground war and have it last for a very long time, as indeed it did, a decade. And what happens there is that the defense contractors, in whose interest CIA serves. CIA does not serve in the interest of the American people, whatever they want to say about protecting us from communism, from terrorism, whatever it is. They wanted to provide what George Orwell discussed as a war of duration. The longer that we would stay in Vietnam, whether it's Afghanistan, the more money that these people make. And that was what it was about. It was about the profits of Halliburton, of Bechtel, of Bell Helicopter, and so forth. And President Kennedy certainly had no interest in that.
Now, in saying that the preponderance of the evidence is that Kennedy did not want the escalation of Vietnam, I guess the person who's had a lot of influence on that topic is Noam Chomsky, who was always harping on his idea that Kennedy was either a warmonger or you don't have enough evidence to tell. Could you comment on that, maybe?
Noam Chomsky and the late Alexander Cockburn and Howard Zinn. I remember I was teaching at Temple. I taught Howard Zinn's book, The People's History of the United States, and there's nothing about the assassinations in this book. And I think that Chomsky and Zinn and all of them, they seem to think that Kennedy was just another capitalist politician. So what's all the fuss about his assassination? But it really isn't true. We have people like Arthur Kroc, the New York Times columnist, a month before the assassination, talking about how the CIA was a malignancy on the body politic of the United States. This was a real warfare within the United States government, and President Kennedy was on one side and CIA was on the other, and there's no question about that. Kennedy was not exactly like all the other politicians, and furthermore, we should be concerned if a president, no matter who it is shot down in the streets of the United States like this.
Absolutely.
Because what we need to protect, not so much the individual, of course we do, but also our society, our democracy, what this country means. Because with the death of President Kennedy, we also have the death of many of our civil liberties. These seem to come together. And foreign wars, wars of preemptive wars, permanent war. Certainly Kennedy wasn't in favor of that. I don't think so. He had no need. He was a rich man's son. And fortifying the corporations wasn't in his mind. I don't think so.
Now let's try to dig into your book as much as we can in our limited time. And of course, people should obviously go and buy it. A Farewell to Justice by Joan Mellon.
I want to talk about one aspect of my book. Two things. In the update, you will find the discussion of the debriefing of Lee Harvey Oswald. And I didn't have that in the original book because I didn't have that research. But subsequently, I did discover that before the Church Committee, James Angleton, who was the head of the counterintelligence of CIA, no, we didn't debrief him. No, that would have been the military anyway. And what I found out was not that at all, but in fact, Oswald was debriefed by CIA in June of 1962 by the Soviet Russia division of it's a big component of the clandestine services. And that I think is really worth the price. And the other that I want to talk about, which is part of the original part of A Farewell to Justice and also the update, is the heart of the Garrison investigation are the travels of Oswald with two CIA people. That's Clay Shaw, about whom we just talked a moment ago, and David Ferry, who was a contract pilot with the agency, flew missions over Cuba. And these three people travel from New Orleans up north of Baton Rouge, and obviously it's all on assignment by CIA. And what they do is they're trying to get Oswald a job at the hospital in Jackson. In Jackson, Louisiana, it's north of Baton Rouge. It's what used to be called an insane asylum. It's a mental hospital, and they bring Oswald to the hospital. Now, I don't know what the CIA had in mind with that, because certainly Shaw, who was a socialite, I want to mention, who hung around with the upper class, very educated person, a playwright, certainly would not choose for his company someone like Oswald, who really was sort of this nondescript individual with no provenance, with not much education. He was just not a likely companion for Shaw, unless Shaw was on assignment. Up they go to the hospital, and when Oswald starts filling out the application for a job at the hospital, it says on the application, and I saw these applications, are you a registered voter of East Feliciana Parish, which is where that was. Now, Oswald obviously was living in New Orleans. He was no registered voter. So then Oswald had to go register to vote in order to get a job at the hospital. He went back to Clinton, which is an adjacent city, a little town there, and he gets online. Now, it turns out that the day that Oswald goes to register to vote, there's a voter registration drive by the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. And so the streets are filled with people, blacks, whites, people looking at each other. And there's Oswald sticking out like a sore thumb, one of two white men on a line of black people trying to overcome the restrictions against their voting. They didn't have their franchise. And there's Oswald. So we have all these witnesses. We have white people, black people, and they didn't speak to each other. So there was no way, as Shaw's attorney said, that they could have created a conspiracy. Because these people, one of them said, Verla Bell, she was one of the officers of CORE, she said to me about somebody, was he white? If he was white, she didn't speak to him, because that wasn't, you cross the street. Whites and blacks did not walk on the same side of the street. So we have all these witnesses, and they came to the trial of Clay Shaw, and they all testified to the same thing, that they saw Oswald up there with Shaw and Ferry. And
Hang on 1 second. I'm sorry, we had another one of the breaks. This is now our 5-minute news break, and we'll be back with Joan Mellon. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. It's our program of the 25th of October. Another reminder, you can see me on C-SPAN 3 with my lecture on the Russian fleets of 1863. C-SPAN 3, Saturday 6 p.m., Saturday 10 p.m., and Sunday at 11 a.m. We're talking with Joan Mellon, the author of the premier study of the Kennedy assassination, A Farewell to Justice. Joan, have you finished that point about the trip to the insane asylum in Louisiana?
I wanted just to say something more about that. When Jim Garrison got the witnesses who were up there in Clinton and who saw Oswald Ferry and Shaw together, and they appeared at the trial. But the problem that the jury had was that the motive was unclear. How could Garrison had not been able to prove, Ferry was dead by now, so he was no longer a defendant. But how could you prove that Shaw was working for CIA? And if he wasn't working for CIA, he didn't seem to have a motive for being anything against President Kennedy. And so it was actually Clay Shaw's own lawyer, Irvin Diamond, who asked Shaw, have you ever worked for CIA? And Shaw denied it. I never have. And Garrison did not have the document that I referred to earlier in which CIA writes that Shaw was a, quote, highly paid contract source. So if he had it, Garrison could have charged Shaw with perjury right then and there.
Precisely. And I think that that does emerge from the movie, that connection. But now let me propose how we proceed now in the 20 or 22 minutes that we have left. First of all, your thesis, as I take it, is that the CIA Operations Directorate, more or less, is responsible for the Kennedy assassination. And then comment on that. And then my traditional division of these things, the patsies, the moles, and the technicians. We should look at Oswald the patsy, look at the various moles who made this possible, and then the technicians who might actually have been doing the shooting. How about that?
That's good, Webster. I was just looking at my own book, reading my own book, and I saw a reference to a figure named Lawrence Howard, who to whom was delivered documents, diagrams of Dealey Plaza by another patsy, a patsy in waiting. Should Oswald not have worked? There were other patsies on the scene, and his name was Thomas Edward Beckham. And he traveled to Dallas a week before the assassination and gave these documents to Lawrence Howard, who was really one of what we call a soldier of fortune or mercenaries involved in anti-Castro activities, and also seems to be involved in the Kennedy assassination.
So I think this is very important. Not only are there multiple Oswalds, there are multiple Oswalds, but there are also spare assassins, lone assassins.
That's right. And I know certainly Lawrence Howard was one. And in fact, one of the other soldiers of fortune, his name was Gerald Patrick Hemming, said to me, this is just in passing, that Howard was the best sniper. He was, he got many, many prizes for being a sniper. So he's a likely person that was on that scene. And as far as Oswald was set up as a patsy in New Orleans and in Louisiana, up there at Clinton and Jackson, by Shaw and Ferry. And so we can, when Oswald was arrested and he said, I'm a patsy, he really was a patsy. And when Thomas Edward Beckham, I went to Louisville to interview him, and he told me about how he was set up also in the event that he was needed. He was terrified. And only later, and this is only in the update, not in the original version of the book, I find out from a friend, a person who had represented Beckham, whose name was Judge Charles McKnight, now retired from the Alabama bench, that Beckham had told him that he, in fact, this is something he held back from me, that in fact he was in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. He was there, and he had seen Oswald on that trip. Now, when Charles McKnight wanted to see Beckham again, this is fairly recently, within the last year, and I had his number, McKnight calls, and Beckham replied to this person whom he knew, I don't know, I never heard of the guy. You have the wrong number. And this is the exact reaction that Beckham gave when Oliver Stone's people called him. They knew that, and wanted him to participate in the film, JFK. I never heard of the man. I never heard of the guy. So Beckham, terrified, has really stopped talking. He liked Charlie McKnight. McKnight won after McKnight had represented him when McKnight was a lawyer in some fraud case involving a country and western show. And they got to be friendly, and then Beckham disappeared. And McKnight asked the FBI, the local FBI, to track him down. And the FBI came back and said he doesn't exist. A week later, Beckham sent McKnight a gift of a chess set. So this is what's going on here. He's terrified. Anybody who's survived after having been involved in any way in the Kennedy assassination is in danger for the rest of their lives. I don't believe
now in June we have 1 million documents released in June, and among these, Oswald's mother repeating that her son was a U.S. agent, a CIA agent. How about the status of Oswald as a multiple agency U.S. spy?
Oh, good question, Webster. What I found in Oswald in New Orleans alone, and Oswald was in New Orleans from April to September of 1963, that Oswald was a low-level CIA. He was also an FBI, and in fact, I talked to his handler. I have to tell this story if I can. His handler was named Warren DeBruys. And I had found from another Cuban named Carlos Brinier, who got into a scuffle in the street on Canal Street with Oswald, that DeBruys had been at Carlos Brinier's store. He had a clothing store a few days before, and he said, I can infiltrate you anytime. Very arrogant in his younger days, brilliant man. And then 3 days later, 2 or 3 days later, Oswald appears at the door. And when Oswald was arrested on Canal Street, oh, by the way, so I asked Mr. DeBruys, I said, didn't you send Oswald to Carlos Brinier's store? And DeBruys, who when I interviewed him was around the year 2000 or so, he had already been deposed by all kinds of government bodies in Washington. He always told the same story. So what DeBruys said to me in answer to that question, did you send Oswald, was, that's far-fetched. I thought that was very amusing because he didn't lie to me directly. He didn't deny it. He just, obviously could not go back against all his earlier testimony. And when the book came out originally, I called Mr. DeBruys just before publication, and I said, or before it went to press, do you have anything more to say to me? And Mr. DeBruys said, a person wouldn't be very intelligent if after all these years he didn't change his mind. Now, that's not evidence, but it's certainly something. He did that as a wink to me, I think. So there's Oswald then. He's part of CIA. He's part of FBI. And I also found, I was the first one to report this, if I may say that. He also worked with U.S. Customs. And the customs officers, one of them from the INS, at that time was called Immigration and Naturalization Service, told the Church Committee, which had deposed people in 1975 or so. Wendell Roche was his name, and he said, I've been waiting 12 years for someone to come and talk to me about this. So he knew Oswald well. And another person who knew Oswald's connection with customs was a bar owner named Orestes Pena, who ran a bar called the Cabana Cuban, I can't remember the name, but right there. And he saw Oswald every day with customs officers. You will not find released, with all these documents, you will not find Wendell Roche's testimony before the Church Committee, and you will not find Orestes Pena's testimony. And I did find a document issuing from Rome, CIA document saying we have destroyed all the Pena records. So that's been wiped clean. So when we talk about records that might have come out in 2017 and all of that, we know a lot of records that are likely never to come out, I don't think, and some that have been destroyed too. The records that have been destroyed include the records of the second-in-command at the New Orleans CIA field office. His name was Hunter Leak. And he had a huge truck, he said, of Oswald files, before the assassination, and he drove them to Washington when they've never been seen since. So yes, Oswald is definitely a figure of U.S. intelligence.
Okay, so Oswald the Patsy. Now, how about some moles? Some of the handlers who protected Oswald, kept him from being arrested, made it possible, and then maybe something on the cover-up by the mole. Oops, we have a break. We're going to come back for our final segment in just a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, Webster Griffin in Washington, D.C. So, Joan, something about the moles, and then we're going to have to run on to do something about the technicians, but just a quick sample of each.
Okay, a quick sample of the moles would be the 9 people who were from all kinds of areas of life, mostly intelligence, who infiltrated Jim Garrison's office, destroyed his records, undermined him in every way they could, undermined witnesses in an attempt to prevent him from having a credible trial against Clay Shaw. What Garrison used the image of from Ernest Hemingway of the old man in the sea. By the time the old man gets the fish back, we just have a skeleton and all the flesh has been eaten off. And that's really what happened. His witnesses were destroyed, they were killed, they were beaten up, they ran away, every which thing happened. Regarding the technicians, I'm not sure. What Jim Garrison always thought, Webster, was we have to focus not on who actually did the shooting, because, I mean, every day, now that the 50th anniversary is here, everybody trying to get some publicity for themselves decides to come up with some name. And these names have been bandied about for 50 years, but no matter, people keep presenting themselves as discovering something new. They're discovering the Warren Report. They did anything to discover something new to get their name in the paper. So we have to be very skeptical, really, about that. Garrison always said we have to learn who plotted this crime. Who is behind it? And there, I'd like to throw out a name. I'm not original with this. One of the people who brought this up was Gayton Fonzie, whom I mentioned earlier, and that's David Atlee Phillips, who was very high up in the clandestine services, who hated President Kennedy, and one of his associates told me that, and probably was very well known for having overthrown President Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. This was his specialty, executive action, and certainly knew and had something to do with the murder of President Kennedy. Phillips.
And so there we are with the CIA Operations Directorate or plans or whatever they call it.
Yeah, the person in charge of the clandestine services was Deputy Director for Plans. But Phillips was not that, but he was pretty close. And he ran, at a certain point, he was in charge of the entire Western Hemisphere operations. So he's pretty high up. And he's right under Richard Helms, who during the time of the Kennedy assassination was deputy himself. It's the name of the clandestine services and also the name of an individual. They use the same term, Deputy Director for Plans. Now, of course, they've done away with that designation. CIA always changes its names, changes the cryptonyms, constantly keeping everyone guessing, keeping their operations secret, and being accountable to nobody.
All right. Now, just looking ahead a little bit, are there any other conferences upcoming that people might be able to go to, or maybe where they can see you?
Thank you for mentioning that. Conferences that are coming up. On November 2nd, which is a Saturday, there's an all-day conference at Rider University, which is in New Jersey, in Lawrenceville, and it's devoted to JFK and Oliver Stone. And Oliver Stone will be there, and I'm sure issues of the Kennedy assassination will be discussed. That's one day. Then, in November 21st to 24th, there's a conference in Dallas, of course, at the Adolphus Hotel. The name of the organization that's running that is JFK Lancer, which is a well-known organization on the subject. At the same time in Dallas, there's also a conference called of the Coalition for Political, it's called COPA, C-O-P-A. And that is being held at the Hotel Lawrence. And I'm speaking at both. I can't recall what COPA stands for at this moment, but if you just press COPA on Google, you'll find it. And it's run by an individual named John Judge. So that's another option, maybe more political, and it includes discussion of other assassinations such as Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. So those are the three big ones that I know that are coming up, especially in Dallas. Well, Dallas is the place, isn't it? The actual ceremonies at Dealey Plaza are run by the mayor of Dallas this year. Nobody who believes in a conspiracy need apply. And the keynote speaker there is David McCullough, who has nothing to do with these subjects. But, the city of Dallas wants to cover up the horror of what happened.
Now, concerning other research, in other words, after people have read your book, A Farewell to Justice, right, including now it's got to be the new edition with the extra 90 pages added, are there any other studies of merit that might get some kind of honorable mention from us here?
Well, of course, I like a lot of the books. I didn't reinvent the wheel. I'm basing all books up. By the way, my publisher for the new edition is Skyhorse Publishing. And I have a website. I'll mention my website, www.joanmellon.com. And I'll also mention that my speech at the WEC conference, I just put it up there on my website, on the homepage, first item. So anyone who wants to read it, it's right up there, easy to access. Regarding other books, I want to mention Gayton Fonzie's book. It's reissue now this fall called The Last Investigation, which is really, Gayton Fonzie was the chief investigator for the House Select Committee of the 1970s. And he really was on the ground, especially in Miami, and he knew what was going on. So he's dead now, unfortunately, died of Parkinson's, but he did a wonderful job. So I certainly give my approval to Gayton Fonzie. And those are the only two. Then we should always look at Mark Lane's original book, which is called Rush to Judgment, and was published in 1966. But amazingly, he interviewed many of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza, and he it's definitely worth going back and looking at some of the history of this period.
Okay. No, we haven't been able to even scratch the surface in terms of why the deeper policy reasons, and there were multiple ones. What I wanted to propose was, since we've got these three coming up, right? We've got the Rider University Conference. We've got
Rider,
Dallas.
It's spelled Rider, R-I-D-E-R.
Right, Rider in Lawrenceville. And then we've got the two events in Dallas. Could we maybe get you back after that to report on what the status of this research is?
What went on? Right. I would be delighted, Webster. I'd love to come on.
And just in general, where is all this going at the present time? That's a big question, because what's been going on, I didn't mention this because I wanted to mention the positive, but what's been going on in the last decade have been book after book insisting that Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson alone, was responsible for the Kennedy assassination. Lyndon Johnson with his lawyer, Lyndon Johnson with his right-hand man, his name was Cliff Carter, and there was no intelligence involvement. And we can see that just as years passed, there was many books written how the mafia was alone did the Kennedy assassination. Now we have Lyndon Johnson. And this been really, in fact, new one just came to my house yesterday by Roger Stone, who had worked for Richard Nixon. And is saying also Nixon and Johnson had a conversation, and Nixon said something like, I couldn't kill him, and Johnson, the implication is he could. And so we have all those books that have to be dealt with, and CIA, from the day that Garrison began, issued a document, April 4th, 1967, how to deal with critics of the Warren Commission. Garrison, well, of course, in 1967, that was his time. He was the chief critic. And so CIA writes this long document, page after page, of how to do that. One way to do it is to accuse the people of being dupes of the Soviet Union in those days, KGB. Okay, Joan, I'm afraid we're out of time. The book is A Farewell to Justice by Joan Mellon, and maybe we can see you in December when all of the events have played out.
Thank you so much, Webster.
Okay, bye-bye.